Welcome to yet another episode of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, the host and founder of this podcast series. My goal, my intent, and the intent of every thought leader who appears on this podcast is to change the way we think about conflict. Today's speaker, Diane O'Connell, is here just to do that, to change we think about the stigmas of mental health in the workplace. Diane comes to us with a very interesting story. She's a mediator, an arbitrator, and an attorney. She's traveled and worked in over 30 countries, including various speaking engagements. One of the things we share together is that she plays the flute, and so do I. Well, she sings in a blues and rock band, which I do not. She's a leader in the New York State Bar Association, and I've had the opportunity of collaborating and working and speaking with her as well. And one of the things that she navigates through is her own experience with a mental health condition that totally and significantly impacted her ability to keep working in her usual capacity. What that has led to is additional certifications and training by becoming a professional practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming, as well as a mental health coach. And she's also in several well-being organizations, including the Mindful Business Charter, the Stability Network, and the Inside Out Leaderboard. Now, Diane also has written a book, and she'll tell you more about it, and we look forward to having Diane with us and being part of our amazing speaker series on decoding the conflict mindset. So stay tuned, don't go away. We'll be starting in just a few more minutes. And if you haven't already subscribed, this is your opportunity to do so right now, or reach out and let your friends and colleagues know about this exciting episode to deal with mental health in the workplace, even in the legal world. Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. And I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, the host and founder of this podcast series. I'm so delighted to bring to you today Diane O'Connell. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Debra. I'm excited to be here.
Well, absolutely. I've already given a little insight to your background and who you are, so I'm not going to go over that now. But I'm curious, for myself, but also I find that many people like to know what's the background story here. How did we get to this topic that we're talking about? And so, Diane, tell us. I know that you are you're a negotiation and risk management attorney, and we're talking about stigmas, mitigating the risk. Tell us how you got to where you are in your story.
Well, I got here a little bit of a long journey, but I'll make it short. I was a risk management attorney in a large firm, and the practice tripled, and they didn't hire any new people. And so I ended up getting overstressed, overtime, no breaks. And when I asked for help, I felt like I was getting that, oh yeah, everything's, you just toughen up. We're fine. Everything's good. And there was a point that I was like, okay, I'm getting so unfocused, I guess is the right word. I'm so in this, whatever is going on. I just felt exhausted all the time. And I said, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm a risk management attorney. This is not the role that you want somebody to be really exhausted. Anyway, it went on for about 3 years until ultimately I just felt like I was melting at my desk and had no energy for anything and was emotional and felt negative all the time. And I ended up going to a doctor, and they said, you really should consider taking medical leave. And even at that point, I was like, well, what are you talking about, taking medical leave? I'm just tired and I'm overworked. And they're like, you need to take medical leave. And then I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, which was just totally blew my mind. So.
Wow, that, that's such I'm so sorry that happened to you, first of all, but that, your story is such an excellent example of what can happen. When we just work, our bodies simply, and I talk about our bodies and our brain simply begin to wear out. They wear down.
Yeah.
And we're unable to function properly. And so I guess I'm curious, you talked about this being a long journey. And so what kind of span of time did this transpire over? I want to give people an idea of how, these things can develop and we're not even aware of it until it's almost too late.
Yeah, no, that usually is the case. I would say it was probably about a 3-year journey that
Okay.
I started to feel the stress and said, I feel like I'm starting to burn out.
Hmm.
And I had my own coping mechanisms. I shut my phone off at night. I made sure I got a decent amount of sleep, ate healthy, and I was really trying to mitigate the stress that was being thrown
Hmm.
at me.
Hmm.
The problem with it is, though, is there was really no downtime. There was no time for my
Hmm.
brain to reset. Almost like a computer, at some point you have to shut it down and restart it. And
Hmm.
that was not happening. My brain was constantly going, going, going. Um, so it was about 3 years until I actually took the medical leave. But I would say probably if I had known what was going on, or if there were people around me
Hmm.
that when I was explaining what was going on, had a little bit more constructive feedback, and
Hmm.
the mental health issue wasn't such a stigma,
Right.
that I probably would have gotten support earlier and taken a step back and could have avoided it. Um, taken a shorter break, but
Hmm.
people don't know and they don't know what to say. And then there's, the HR stuff where how much do you say? Can you say it? How do you approach it? Is it going to sound like discrimination? But I would say the dismissal of what I
Hmm.
was going through or the requests I was making really kind of exacerbated the situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely, employers' responsiveness to employee concerns, is huge in recognizing a situation that could be detrimental. A couple of things I want to share about that, because actually my mediation practices focuses on working with employees and employers when medical conditions impact their ability to work. And so I've been at this since the early 90s, and so I can't tell you how many times over and over again that I've heard stories similar to yours about how employees saying, this isn't working, something's not right, gotta make
Yeah.
some adjustments, only to have put up a hand to the face, not listening. And so that employer unresponsiveness is huge in driving
Yeah.
factors like this. And I think we can all identify with having to put in extra work and working really hard and long hours on a short-term basis. But when it
Yeah.
becomes unhealthy is when it is protracted over time. And like you said, there was just no break. I don't know if you're aware of this, Diane, but there's actually a Japanese word for working to death. It's called
Okay.
karoshi, Karoshi, karoshi. And I first read about this, quite a few numbers years ago, but where people would, be working in manufacturing plants and they would just work at people literally drop dead at work.
Yeah.
And so, it really, spoke to the need for us to take care of ourselves in ways that, kept us alive, kept us healthy, and
Yeah.
kept us working. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess, given your own experience, Diane, if you could sort of, I guess summarize maybe one or two or three key things that you learned through that process, and what kinds of recommendations would you make to employers out there as far as what they can do to avoid employees going to the depths that you did?
Yes. Well, the three key things I would say is self-awareness. When somebody feels like something isn't right, and if they're self-aware enough to actually go out and reach out to ask for help and don't get it, and it's chances are that they need to make a decision about what they're going to do, because the employer is not necessarily listening or in the position or has the emotional intelligence or whatever it might be
Mhm.
to say, okay, we recognize there's an issue here. Let's address it. So that would be one thing. The other thing is, don't be afraid, and this goes for the employer and the employee. Don't be afraid to admit that you're having a hard time coping.
Mhm.
It's not a weakness. It's not, there's this, you know, US work ethic of
Mhm.
toughen up,
Yeah.
like just, keep going, we can do it. You have grit, just, you can plow through.
Mhm.
And I get that, but there's plowing through, one weekend because there's a deadline is one thing.
Mhm.
Plowing through 3 years is something completely different.
Yeah.
Um, and then the third thing is especially for professionals, I would say that your brain is your asset. And if you don't take care of it, then you are useless. You can't do your job. You're not functioning right. And you're going to end up making mistakes and it's going to be costly.
Yeah.
And that's where the risk management part comes in, is uh, if this isn't balanced well with communication and a reciprocal conversation with an open dialogue, then both parties are at risk. One's at risk for their career and their mental health. Another one is at risk for potentially getting sued and lost productivity and so on and so forth. So my advice to employers would be to open up a dialogue, allow people to express if they're having a difficult time and ask questions. Don't dismiss it. A second thing I would suggest for employers is that I think every organization should have their people do a mental health first aid class, which is, some people say isn't enough, and I agree it's not enough, but it's a start. It teaches everybody how to have those communications with each other, where to eliminate the stigma. So when somebody says, "How are you doing?" You say, "Great, I'm fine." In the meantime, you could be melting. Your mom could have just passed away. You could have just gotten a divorce. You could have found out you had cancer. But everybody's answer is always, "I'm doing great. Everything's fine." So the mental health first aid class actually helps people understand how to have those conversations when somebody says, "You know what? I'm not doing so great today. I just found out that my mom has cancer and only has 6 weeks to live." And the other person, instead of cringing and feeling really awkward and uncomfortable, would have the tools to have that communication and say, "I'm really sorry to hear that. Do you want to have a conversation and talk about it? What can I do to help?" And offer that support and make it okay for people to not be okay.
Yeah.
So that would be the second thing for employers. And then the third thing I would say is, your employers, and this is probably stolen from somebody a little bit, but your employers, while they're there to serve you, and I don't like the word serve, has a strange connotation, so I'm using it loosely. But especially in the managerial roles, your staff is there not just to make you look good and to get the work done and to serve you, but you're there to serve them. And if you don't serve them, you're not going to get back what it is you need. So the support should be reciprocal, understanding that it's a team no matter what level you're at. So those would be the three things I would suggest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love all three of them, and let me go back and amplify a little bit. I just love that whole idea about a mental health first aid class. One of the things that I talk about is that, when you think about physical safety, it's like, boy, we come a long way, baby. I mean, from the 1930s, and I oftentimes use the whole construction of the Golden Gate Bridge as being an excellent example about how they implemented, first time ever, safety things like harnesses and, hard hats and steel-toed boots and all that kind of stuff. And so instead of losing the projected 35 lives, they lost only 11. And I don't mean that lightly, because 11 is still a lot. And 10 of those 11 actually died in one fell swoop when some safety harnessing broke loose. But, if you look at over the years in physical safety, we have improved so greatly, in first aid and safety classes, and they're required every year and so forth. And I oftentimes will say, but we have done so little when it comes to psychological safety. Whether it's, how you're treated by, bullies in the workplace or whatever, or like in your case, being overly worked, extreme workload issues and prolonged exposure to workload issues. We still have so far to go on that. And so a mental health first aid class, and we certainly know that mental health issues are, at an all-time high right now for lots of various reasons, but there is increased recognition. I've been in my field, for long, and I hate to say it, 35 plus years, and it's like finally people are giving recognition to all this stuff,
Right.
But I love that idea about a mental health first aid class. And then, I like how you use the word, fine, it's like, I came up with an acronym for that.
Okay.
Okay.
What is it?
I use false, when people go fine, it's like false information necessitating exploration. So false information needing or necessitating exploration. Don't just stop there.
Yeah.
And
Excellent.
that's where it goes back to you, it's like, what's going on? That doesn't sound
Yeah.
so fine. Yeah.
Right.
And to
And that
take,
is the foundation of the first aid, the mental health first aid class as well.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then I like what you had to say, because there's a lot being said over the last few years about servant leadership. And again, exactly what you said, as far as you need to get back to your people to get people back. That's what the basic law of reciprocity, and you use that word already, is that you got to give to get
Yes.
back. And I like to say, you
Yeah.
better watch what you give because you might get it back.
It
Your
works
employer
both
lost
ways,
an
right?
excellent, your employer lost an excellent attorney and risk manager. So
I think so.
yeah, yeah. And you're up doing bigger and greater things then. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm curious, again, you've had quite the journey. You've been there firsthand, not only as a lawyer, risk manager, but also an employee who dealt with this. And so, what is it about individual well-being can only go so far, and where again that relationship with an employer needs to kick in as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because I had said earlier, I'm very self-aware. I'm very
Mhm,
attuned to what I'm feeling when I need rest.
mhm,
I have a pretty good self-care routine.
mhm.
Um, but I just blanked. Sorry.
Well, you're talking about self-care, and you're pretty attuned, pretty aware to yourself, and I mentioned about how this might be a partnership with your employer in terms of how can this be brought out more.
Yeah. I think that employers, I think they're well intended. The programs they try to put in place and things they
Mhm,
try to do, they really are well intended.
mhm,
But it's like anything else that's amorphous and hard to measure. It's hard to understand what's going to work and what isn't. So I use the example of if you break your leg, you're in a cast for 6 weeks, you cast comes off, you go to physical therapy, you know
mhm,
when your leg doesn't hurt anymore. An employer understands you had a broken leg, you're on crutches in a cast. It's
mhm.
very, for lack of no pun intended, concrete. And then everybody understands a
Yeah.
broken leg.
Mhm, mhm,
When you have a mental health issue, there are some people who just, there are people who walk around and often say, I'm really stressed. I have so much work. I have this, I have that. So it's hard to understand when it's a little bit of a cry wolf thing,
mhm, mhm,
perceived as a crying wolf thing,
mhm.
because even those people are saying something that you're not hearing, or they wouldn't be saying it over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like dispute resolution. You get into the dispute because basically the conversation is crossing and people aren't hearing what the other person means.
Mhm,
And so it's the same thing with employees and employers. And I think that employers just really need to take a pause and understand that the employer doesn't have all the answers, the
mhm,
employee doesn't have all the answers, and it's something that has to be worked out,
mhm.
but it is something that costs employers tons of money. So the stats say that employers will spend a certain amount of money on physical health safety. So the safety equipment, the ergonomic chairs, the harnesses for construction, they spend 25% of that amount on mental and psychological safety. Yet the psychological safety costs them 4 times the amount of the physical injuries.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of an amazing statistic that when you something that you can't measure and you can't see, and it's very hard because of the stigma, because people don't know how to deal with it. It's a very difficult obstacle to overcome in the workplace. But
Yes.
with open dialogue, I think that, I think it's possible.
Well, anything's possible if we just have an
Yeah.
open mind to it, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so what I'm hearing, and I know you use this term in us getting ready for today, well-being, it's a constant negotiation. Elaborate on that.
Well, it's the difference between Eastern and Western philosophy. Western
Mm,
philosophy is very linear,
yeah.
and you start at point A and you end at point B. You start your career, you retire. Like people have this very linear of I'm going to, graduate high school, go to college, maybe get an MBA, or they're going to graduate high school, get an apprenticeship, become a master, carpenter. Like whatever it is, it's a very linear step by step, like climbing a flight of stairs. West Eastern philosophy is a bit more like a meandering river, where it recognizes that life is never going to be a straight path. And in fact, David Brooks wrote that book, The Second Mountain, talking about how people really thrive and learn when they have critically failed, and then use that experience to go up and make changes to actually succeed on the next try. And so the Eastern philosophy approach is very meandering. And I would say it's the same thing with well-being, whether in the workplace, individual well-being, whatever it is. It's a little bit like a meandering river. One morning you might wake up and say, "Oh, wow, what a beautiful day. The sun is shining. It's 75 degrees. I can't wait to get out and do something." And you get a phone call with bad news and it just kind of crashes. And then you're like, "Okay, let me regroup and, figure this out." The reason I'm using that example is that well-being is not something that employers or employees can put in place. Like, you can't put a program in place and say, "Okay, we built the program, let it grow." That's like building the baseball field and saying, "If I build it, they will come."
Yeah.
Every salesperson knows that's not true.
Yeah.
So you can't just build it. You have to actually continue to nurture it, and you have to take steps back, assess what's working, assess what's not working, and on a holistic level. So for employers, it's you have to look at your benefits packages. Do they still work for the demographic of employees? You have to look at your attrition rates, your absenteeism rates. You have to look at the programs you're offering. Are those programs being used right? Do they work with each other? Do they complement each other? You have to have conversations with the employees and continue to monitor and take the temperature of the employees and the climate and your clients and the economics. And it's acting with agility and resiliency. So it's always a negotiation because there's no right answer for it. There's no end game. Nobody's ever going to get it perfect unless you become the Dalai Lama, maybe. And I think even he has his moments that he questions. So it is that meandering river that you have to constantly negotiate to try to keep everything afloat.
Yeah, yeah. And it's sort of like too, like one size does not fit all. So some, flexibility, but also it's not one and done. You can't just say, "Okay, here's a program, I've done my deal," and then walk
Right.
away. Like you said, you've got to culture it, you've got to nurture it and evolve it over time.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, our world of work is so diverse these days. And again, we're global entities on so many levels and fronts. And, our workplaces are very diverse with people from different walks of life. How do you see cultural differences showing up? And what can we learn from those, how people are different? And then how do they get in the way?
Given the fact that I've done an awful lot of international negotiation, it's interesting because one of the things that I found is that it is really helpful to be culturally in tune with who's on the other side of the table, to understand where they're coming from, what their concerns are, how they communicate, the level of politeness. Like in Costa Rica, if you say something to somebody and they say, "Yes, of course," and you think you have an agreement, and then they come back later and go, "Well, here's what I think about that." So they won't say no, but they will come back, they'll counter you later on, So that, I mean, this across the globe it's an interesting endeavor to try to figure out are you culturally sensitive? How do you come to an agreement when the communication isn't necessarily aligned or in parallel with each other? And bringing it into a diverse workplace, it's a gift and it's a challenge, because the gift is that you have people with perspectives of backgrounds and upbringing and uh, different educations, that they can really add innovation. And the DEI space talks about this all the time, diversity creates innovation, and it's true. If you put everybody into a room that thinks the same, acts the same, has the same background, there's no way you can create innovation because they're going to have blind spots. They're not going to see a lot of the missing pieces. So I think the cultural diversity is a phenomenal gift that we have to give each other. The challenge of it is for people to understand how to adapt to and extract to the cultural differences. How do you know that what you're saying is what the other person understands to be true? How do you take what they're saying and utilize it when you don't have context for it? And that takes some work. That takes having an open mind and being cognizant of the fact that you don't know everything, and sometimes there are better ways to do it. But it takes having a psychologically safe platform for everybody to share their ideas and for them to be respected, to keep that cultural diversity going and to keep it nurtured.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned, fear earlier, and that's where, I think a lot of fear comes up in not understanding where people are coming from culturally. And again, maybe having some predisposed biases and attitudes about different cultures. And I know when I was growing up, and it's partly why I do what I do in terms of teaching a cultural diversity class, but also working with medical conditions. It's both because of and an adverse response to my dad. And my dad was very charismatic, very much a leader in his work and in the community. But boy, did he have an attitude about anybody who looked different than he did. And he spoke it. He said it, and I would just be a little kid going, how do you know that? Why would you say that about that person? Do you know that? Have you had experience with them? And so even at 7 or 8, I was challenging him. So, oh well. And I think, it's really a learning opportunity. And, I'm both excited and fearful about, where we can go. But Diane, you've opened up some really important things about, and thank you for being candid and being vulnerable to share your own story. I know that's not always easy to do, but again, what you've learned from it and what you can teach other professionals. I love what you had to say about, particularly for professionals, your brain is your asset. And if you're not taking care of it, you just lost your major asset right there. And so it really is a wake-up call to, our mental health, our well-being, our self-care that you talked about. I love the idea about the first aid class and again, it's a reciprocal relationship in the workplace. The leaders really need to be, what can I do for you? Not just what are you doing for me, and knowing how to respond to that. I'm fine. So I know that you have a book, Diane, on Amazon, and tell us a little bit more about that, and tell us what you plan to offer.
Well, it's called The 5 Mistakes That Leaders Make, and it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek with a serious topic. There's some bad dad jokes in there, just to lighten up the mood a little bit. Because one of the things I find is that the topic can be intense. It could be uncomfortable. And for me, I find that adding a little bit of humor and lightheartedness to it makes it a little bit easier for people to absorb. So it basically just runs through, some of the mistakes that leaders make and the assumptions that they make, with some suggestions on how they can look at it and how they can look at things a little bit differently and approach things a little bit differently to make some improvements.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so I think, you said that when we go live, that you're going to make the link available to our participants to download at no charge as your compliment to let's spread the word.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually one of the technical things that I have to figure out. I looked at it and I know that you can do it. And I think that there's going to be a code. So perhaps what I can do is look into it and we can add the code in to the text or closing and I can confirm that. Does that work?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay.
Yep. I want to just close, Diane, as we talk about this, is that, what I'm just amazed that you've traveled to all 30 countries. And that's just incredible, and so I imagine that was a living and learning experience right there too.
Yeah, I would say, honestly, for me, I started to travel because I was curious about the human spirit. And I grew up too with a parent who was very bigoted. And I would say things like, well, what about my friend so-and-so? He's gay. And she's like, oh, I don't mean him. That's always, I don't mean the person I know. And it never resonated with me growing up. I always felt like I was adopted somehow because it's just like the mentality never made any sense. And so one of the things that I don't know why this happened, but I just had this drive to go travel and to go explore the world and to understand people and their cultures and see different colors and scents and foods. And it has been an unbelievable lesson for me in the human condition, and the reality is that of all the places I've gone to, some of the stories are kind of kooky and, it makes for good dinner conversation. But what I've realized is that no matter where I've gone, whether it's to a five-star hotel or a riad in Marrakesh or a small hostel in Cambodia, that, whatever people's economic situations are, their cultures, whatever education level, everybody wants the same thing. They want to feel valued, they want to feel like they belong, and they want to have a voice and feel safe.
Yes.
So, and that goes with, food, shelter, and love. But I mean, really, that's what everybody wants. And I think so many people are afraid of losing that. They makes them insecure. And that's where this stigmas come from and the disputes come from. That's
Yeah.
it's all like the fear-based, the fear of losing something, the scarcity feeling. And if we feel abundant and share with each other, then to a certain degree, obviously, I'm not, suggesting we all go back to 1969, but it's not the hippie thing, but I do think that if we're generous of spirit with each other, that what we get back in return is going to be tenfold.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And that's partly why I have my moniker, the Mindset Doc. And that's why we have this podcast. It's all about changing the way we think about conflict, changing the way we think about our differences, because after all, we are all part of the human race. And in that regard, we have many more similarities than we do dissimilarities. So, Diane, I want to thank you so much for being here today and sharing on this very important topic around stigma, mental health in the workplace, your journey, and great recommendations you've given to our employers and employees out there, and your 5 mistakes that leaders make. So download it, pass it on, whatever. We need to change the mindset. We need to just shift a different way going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And on closing, the one thing I would say quickly is that everybody should keep in mind the one limiting reagent in their life is time. So don't waste time because we all only have a finite amount of it and should be used with grace and generosity.
Yes. Thank you.
So,
excellent words to close on. So, well, here you have it, Decoding the Conflict Mindset, another excellent thought leader who is shifting and shaping the way we think about conflict differently. And so your brain is your asset. So let's do something with it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Debra.
Well, I hope that you found the interview with Diane O'Connell, attorney turned mediator, arbitrator from the state of New York, very interesting. Because, as a professional, she's experienced firsthand actually what happens when workload becomes incessant, when we start to suffer psychologically and physically, and when the employer is not a good resource. So if this is something that resonates with you, please pass it on. And if you have a story like Diane's that you'd like to share on decoding the conflict mindset, contact me, Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc. You'll see my contact information, particularly on LinkedIn, and reach out. Let me know if you're interested. I'd love to have you. Well, we're continuing on our theme about workplace and workplace challenges. I think we can all agree workplace has been pretty challenged, not just individually, but organizationally. Many companies have struggled about bringing people back to work in the workplace, dealing with remote work, but also dealing with the increase in mental health. I'm excited to have Kevin Robertson, a licensed practitioner like myself, who also is specialized in the world of work. And he is now with Abriotics, a nationwide company that provides mental health and psychological services, accommodations, and things like that. I actually know Abriotics before they went nationwide. I used to do some work with them. And so with Kevin's perspective, he's going to share with us some things about violence prevention, the stigma around mental health, and how important internal training of providers becomes, and how to spot those red flags when things are not going well and before things escalate into workplace violence. My particular interest in having Diane or Kevin and others to come yet is because in California, a new bill has been passed and goes into effect June 1st on employer requirements for developing a workplace violence prevention plan. So don't go away, do subscribe, make sure that you receive notifications for our next upcoming podcast as we continue to dive into the violent and unhealthy aspects of today's workplace organizations. Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc. Again, subscribe below, pass this on, invite others to come. It could be people who've developed or experienced difficult situations, or maybe it's that HR professional or CEO that really needs to hear this message. I look forward to seeing you, join our community, and we'll be back decoding the conflict mindset.